What is up, Pushin Performance family? I am super excited for this one. JT and I had the opportunity to basically fanboy over the legend Joel Smith. And Joel has arguably influenced my career more than anyone, albeit from afar. But let's be real, if you're listening to this podcast, you definitely know who Joel is. But if you don't, he's a coach, he's a writer, and one of the great thinkers in the sports performance field. He's the host of the Just Fly Performance podcast, has written multiple books on jumping and sprint performance, and has multiple courses available on his website, all of which can be found through the link in the description of this show. But in today's conversation, we got to talk about all of our favorite topics, and that is play. Specifically, how coaches can use play to improve buy-in and performance where it matters on the field. So without further ado, I am so pumped for y'all to jump into this. Let's get to it. Joel, thank you so much for coming on the show, man. JT and I have been longtime fans of your work. I think your speed strength sitting on my shelf here somewhere. Been through the courses. Um, yeah, I think I have a bit of a reputation now for being. Oh, there we go.
Oh
There we
yeah,
go.
that's the original work.
That one's been passed around too. Like JT gave it to me, I gave it to somebody else, who gave it to somebody else, who gave it back to JT. There's a lot of weird notes in there from
Yeah.
like 5 or 6 coaches, but I think I've gotten the reputation now of being the play guy, of being the guy who tries to implement play and implement exploration into training, and that 1000% comes from you. So I guess to start in a world of strength and conditioning that is pretty cookie cutter, that is very regimented, how did you find this kind of concept of play and bring it into training?
Sure. Well, thanks, Phil and JT, for having me on. And I love that you asked when you messaged me, hey, let's talk about play. Like, that's the thing I'm by far the most excited about in many respects. I mean, I still love, I'm a track coach, so I still love anything output related and speed and jumping. But in so many ways, even my track coaching practices, and I have to watch myself sometimes just because I think sometimes you can enjoy the play aspect so much. There's the child part and there's the adult part and there's distinctions between those types of minds and the focus and like the complex versus serial training or organized.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes I even still get carried away. But maybe there's that big kid part of me that's always been there. But I think going back to strength and conditioning, I'm 41. And when I got started in deciding I wanted to do this thing, it was 2001 was my first internship. And I think there's the stories like the 90s where strength and conditioning is becoming more of a full-time profession. I mean, even in the 90s, if you're a strength coach, you're still barely, back then it was like you get paid $18,000 a year and you're sleeping in your car or something, like the OGs, a lot of them. And so I was getting into it when it was starting to become more of a viable profession. And I remember my first internships, though, and so the backstory with that is I am very self-taught with a lot of these things. Like, it was when I'm a teenager, I didn't have a strength coach. There was no private strength coaches. That it was just acceleration, like Frappier acceleration, and like these places you could go were just getting started. And I remember they were in the news, like athletes doing box jumps. It's like, oh, you can go to these places and get faster. But the funny thing is, even at that point, though, I had been through age 16 or 17, like all the jump programs and every, self-taught weights. And of course, I made loads of mistakes, but it was kind of this thing where when I finally at age 21 got to, okay, this is strength and conditioning. And I had honestly, and I'm not saying this to try to pump ego in any way. I'm still learning. I mean, honestly, in 10 years, I'm going to look at 40-year-old Joel and be like, man, what were you doing with this, this?
Yeah.
But I had essentially a 10-year experience up to that point, intuitively finding what worked. And then I finally got to my first strength and conditioning internship, and I'm all excited. And I roll in, and it's just like the most basic robotic, like cookie cutter conditioning, yelling at the athletes. There's very little like athleticism or nuance to any of that stuff. And honestly, I was so underwhelmed by the whole experience. it made me not want to get into strength and conditioning. I was like, I still did, but I when it came to that hard fork in the road where you're going to pick one or the other, track or strength and conditioning, because in grad school I was told I had to, and I guess you do kind of have to. I still got my CSCS, but I pursued applying for track coaching jobs because
Huh.
to me that was the more stimulating thing. And I think it's because at the time, track, it was motor learning, outputs, and the outputs are what wins, versus, it's, hey,
Yeah.
we got faster. That's great. But like, this is what puts points on the board. And it's a yearly process, and there's not that interplay, or you could say interference. A lot of times it's interference. When it's a good situation, it's an interplay between sport coach and strength coach.
Yeah.
And so to me, that was the stimulating thing. And in some ways that was play to me, track. Whereas, and then my second internship in strength and conditioning was the same thing. I remember it like it was yesterday. It was grad school. It was my first day, and I'm 22 years old, and we're the strength coach has the girls soccer team in, and it's like, all right, we're doing these lifts and we're doing push presses, and the coach is like, keep your feet on the floor. And I asked the coach, why do they have to keep their feet on the floor? Because that athletic reflex, the feet kind of come up quick and slap back down.
Yeah.
And she's like, oh, you just do it that way. And I was so I don't know. It was, maybe it was bad luck. Honestly, I think a lot of it was bad luck, because if I had coaches that respected more of the athletic nuances, maybe I would have seen things a much different way. But
Yeah.
so in some ways, if you want to start with polarization, on one end you have just very robotic, do it because I said so, and on the other hand you have play, which is in some way, yes, it's rolling the ball out and having fun, but it's also kind of this opening to all the potential of life. It's kind of like going for a walk in the woods and looking at every bug and critter and leaf and sitting in wonder, And so to me, the typical way strength and conditioning was done, it was the opposite. It was just do it because I said so. Get strong, do these lifts because I said so. There was very little understanding of why athletes jump high, run fast, make decisions on the field. And so that kind of itching for something deeper in the industry always sat there in my system. And I did track for 6 years, 4 years full time, and then strength and conditioning called me back, and I got the job at UC Berkeley, Cal, as a strength coach. And so now I'm a strength coach after all the years of being like, well, no, I like track more because, and it was what I was familiar with. I was basketball and track in high school. And so then I started kind of the traditional again, and as a little bit of a newbie in the sense that I hadn't had a traditional strength and conditioning training. So here I am from my couple of bosses, the head Olympic and the head strength coach, teaching me various ways, this is how you do it. And they were extremely good at what they did. And so I'm going through that, but then as I'm going through it, there's still kind of that itch that's coming up again. And then between a podcast with like Rafe Kelly and then spending time with Paul Cater, who I think was on you guys' podcast, and just seeing how Paul approached it, I would slowly start to inject more play-like things into the training. And it just kind of snowballed. That was probably about, I want to say that was probably of my 7 years at Cal. That was probably about 2 or 3 years in that really started to get going. And then it just eventually culminated in athletes come in, we try to play for a set amount of time as much as we can. Some teams more than others. Like the men's tennis team, we would just play basketball for a half hour. But men's water polo, they wouldn't have that. Like we tried to do some roughhousing one time, and some guy like almost got his nose broken. And so it was just and they just wanted to be like, very formal, like I mentioned, child, adult, like they wanted the very intensive type work, and we had our own way we did that. And so essentially that's kind of how it all went, in that I always had that side of me. I always had that wonder, curiosity side, that one side that just and just a playful side, and I always wanted to see that in training. And then after leaving Cal, I started coaching youth sports, working with like a youth soccer program in the area, coaching ages 5 to 6. And then that's been really good for me as well, because that's just like, how much fun can we have? And so just
all play.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. So yeah, that's how it started, and that's kind of where it's going. And then even now, like I just did a seminar with Austin Yoakum, and just seeing what he does in person is amazing. And so it's like you learn from like Paul and Austin and these other coaches, seeing what they're doing. And so that's kind of where I am now. So I probably took that question much
No,
farther. How did you get started? How did I get started all the way to where I am now? So yeah, that's the story. Sorry, I probably spent way too long on that.
no, you're good. There's a lot of good nuggets to unpack. It's unfortunate you had some bad luck, but I feel like that's the stuff that shapes you, the stuff that kind
Yeah.
of drives you to the coach you end up becoming. But you mentioned the groups that are maybe like you said, like the little more adult training that's regimented. We're coming in here, we're checking the box, or we're a little more militant with how we operate. And then the groups that just like, I played tennis in high school and we very much just played. I didn't touch a weight till college.
Mhm.
So, I know how that is. But do you think even for those groups, those people in general, whether they're an athlete, a member of the general population who's like, I want to come in, I want to get my butt kicked, or I want to like, you know, I want to see the XYZs of what I'm doing. I don't like the surprise of play. Like, do you think those individuals still need a little like to interject some of that stuff into their training?
Yeah. I'm glad you said the word militant, because I think like Paul, and I've had conversations with Paul Cater about this, is like you have like youth sports, like ages 13 to 16, and there's a very like there can be a very play-like aspect to that movement, but then you might have military come in and they're very regimented, and that's kind of what they expect. Write the workout, let's get it done, like protocol. And that's kind of something I've been working with, is we have play versus protocol, but both have a place. And I think that's what we tend to do a lot of times, is we say, oh, well, it's either one or the other. And it's not necessarily. But I will say, I do work a few times a year. I work with military trainees, people who are getting into or going into special ops. And I do a lot of it's like running coaching. I work with Jeff Nichols there. Jeff's awesome. And so it's interesting because this group is there because they are going to be it's going to eventually be very protocol oriented. But what I found, and they still love doing play-based work. And for them, I like using play because play represents the highest intensity things can get. Because you can, like when we do run training, we can do all the running and the drills and even the laps. But to be honest, there's always there's always going to be a general regulator there, because you're much more conscious of the fatigue that's being generated. Where as soon as you're in a game, everything changes. The stimuli now dictate what your body does, and parts of your brain get shut off. And then all of a sudden, you're like, man, this is so much harder even than maybe the repeat sprints or long sprints that we may have been doing. Now, for some athletes who really take it upon themselves to run hard and they don't have the limiter, they can get where they would be in a team sport. But for a lot of athletes will never get to the level of conditioning and heart rate and that spike doing running that they would actually playing the team sport. And I see that all the time, even coaching children. Not that I would ever have children run like for laps or stuff. That would be silly. But like if I said, hey guys, run these laps and I'm timing you, they would probably complain or wonder why we're doing it. And maybe start out sprinting and then start walking or whatever, But the moral of the story is they will work far harder playing a game. Like we played freeze tag the other day, and I didn't bring all my cones to practice because I was somewhere in my garage, and it's been really dry here, so the lines on the field aren't very solid. But anyways, we opened up the space to the whole field for freeze tag, and usually it's real small. So these kids are running all over the place, and they are working so hard. Like they might as well have been running repeat 200s, but to them, they are processing it so differently. And again, I think that's just where you have to experience the play side to see that processing and see the heart rates. And people will tell you this, they hook up athletes to heart rates even during ultimate frisbee versus conditioning, and what you're going to see. And so again, to a lot of strength, it's like, okay, well, athletes are already getting that in their sport. We see this. And so, yes, okay, like but I think you need to really fully understand that to make more sense of what do we do outside of that and how do we approach it.
Yeah, that's
Love
good.
it.
When you mention like play, what is it exactly in terms of like how you would define that within the context of the weight room? Like if there's a new coach that's like first day an intern as an intern under you, Joe, and you say play, how would you like really describe that other than the obvious like games that you can start to put into the person's program? Like how would you have somebody really think about that on a scale to essentially gamify anything else that they can do moving forward?
Yeah, it's a good question, because a lot of people who get into strength and conditioning, I had this thought the other day. Like, it's not the natural athlete who gets into strength and conditioning. It's not the kid who was good at everything and didn't really love lifting. You know, it's not the kid who wasn't excited, or not excited, but it wasn't the kid who maybe missed the line in conditioning, you know, didn't step on the line or whatever, right? That kid never is not going to get into it. It's the person who actually probably liked a little bit the conditioning, you know, aspect of practice, who loved the weights. And so, you know, that being said, I just think in some ways you have to, one, remember how intense sport itself is. And then you use that as a backdrop when you actually get into the strength side. Now, I will say, I think you cannot know much about play and still be a pretty good strength coach from just the raw protocol side of things. And you see this in like NFL strength coaches who are like HIT coaches. Like it's like one set of 10, or not 10, like it's one intense fatiguing set on more of a machine, a more ground type activity. And it works because you have athletes who are really good athletes on the field. They're playing and they're getting all their explosive needs for the most part on the field. And your job is just to condition the tissues and prevent injury. And you know what? You're probably going to be all right. And I think that's okay. But I just think that there's a lot of shades of the industry. You know, that's a job that exists somewhere, but it's not like, I think the average person, especially in the private sector, you're called upon to paint a lot more brushes of the total equation. And so that all being said, how I would look at play is it's the most stimulated the human being can be, unless you're like a specialist in the thing. If you're a specialist in the power lifts, you'll be maximally stimulated by the power lifts. If you're a specialist in distance running, you'll be maximally stimulated by distance running. But if you're somewhere in the middle, what gets your body going to the greatest degree? How will you prepare? Like, what preps you to jump the highest? It's playing basketball or it's ultimate frisbee. You will be far higher in an output perspective than you ever would be doing any sort of traditional warm-up. So just that right there, why would you keep doing the traditional thing if you were seeking now, this being said, that's for an output though. Again, that's if I'm the NFL strength coach, maybe I don't need to worry about that so much because I just need to keep players strong and healthy and prevent injuries. So now it's a different hat. But everyone loves speed. Like this is the thing I think is kind of fun. Like I'm a track coach. I love speed, but it's like that. We love it almost too much, I think sometimes, just in my opinion. I just think because there's so much like shades of skill and all these other things that make that ultimate
For sure.
total equation. But you know, even like speed, like if you want to be fast, you have to play to see what fast is, in my opinion. Because if you're just doing the more mundane drills, you're only getting a portion of the fullness of our humanity. You're not getting the whole thing. So it is that thing that unlocks the maximal outputs and also the ability to be good at your sport. Sorry, I just talked a lot to basically say it in the last sentence there.
No,
Maximal
that
output
paints a
is
good
the thing that
that
makes you
paints
good
a
at your
good
sport.
picture. So
Yeah.
I appreciate that. It's just interesting to really think about because, like you and Phil said, it's not been really done, at least on the mainstream side of things within our industry. So it's good to hear a little bit more in a way of like it being more what's the word I'm looking for? Accepted, hopefully, in our industry a little bit more. So I know Phil talks my ear off about play all the time. So he's
Constantly.
he's
Just
jumping
constantly
off
talking
his
about it.
seat right now, just having
It's the
more
best thing.
thoughts.
It's the best thing that's ever happened. No, it's you mentioned this kind of idea that we have to read and react and perceive our environment, but also playing allows us to achieve these higher outputs because it really lowers inhibition and just we're just trying to make a play. We're trying to make something happen. And I think about all the pickleball injuries, and my wife just hurt her foot playing pickleball, and a lot of that is like something you would never ever do in the gym. Like I know a lot of adults who look at a box, like a 12-inch box, and they say, I could never jump on that. And then they get on the pickleball court and they start trying to do the craziest things you've ever seen with their body because they're not thinking about it. They're like, I want to beat my husband. I want to beat, this person across me. It's the same thing with kids. Like I can think back to so many times working with youth athletes, and we get them like running 10s or 20s or something, or you're trying to jump over hurdles, and they're shy. They're maybe a little intimidated to be a part of the group and all this stuff. It's kind of a weird experience for them. It's artificial. but then you roll out a ball or you roll out an obstacle course or something, and all of a sudden, like all of that just kind of falls away, and they're able to just kind of express movement that you wouldn't have thought that they can perform. And I think, like, I've heard you mention that a ton. I just think that's such a really cool and often overlooked aspect of it, because like you kind of allude to, it's easy to look at it and be like, you're just goofing off. Like there's no value here. You know what I mean?
I completely agree. Even pain too, right? We've all seen the athletes like, my knee it's kind of hurting or whatever it is, right? And then throw the ball out, and all of a sudden they completely forget about it and just start going like nothing happened.
Yeah,
we've all been there.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely wild how like that release of inhibition can come from just like doing something simple. But are there any we mentioned up top of like the practical things that people want to get, like are there any things that you're playing around with now that you maybe haven't done before that you've been exploring?
Yeah, a lot of it is, I mean, there's several things. A lot of it's trying to unpack exactly what Paul Cater was doing when I first started training with him. Like, I want to say
Fair.
probably about 10 years ago or over 10 years ago was our first training sessions together. And I just remember it was so stimulating. I wrote a article a long time ago about like a trail run we did together. And that wasn't even the first time. We had done other training before where literally like, I mean, my vertical jump probably went up similar to what it would have been basketball. And I'd never had just training with Paul in the gym, just doing like all the things that Paul does. He's using music and rhythm and making things a dance, or like whipping a basketball at you as fast as he can. Just stuff like it, but like breath, eyes, and touch, like eyes, vision, things that are like skill and task oriented. And he's very skillful at understanding that complete environment. Or like a trail run we went on, and we're running through this windy trail. I feel my feet bending as I'm going around curves. You're like hurdling weeds and bushes and all this stuff. And then so it's like sprints and long and terrain. And then after, felt so stimulated, like jumping out of the gym type feeling from these things. So it's like, it's been years of almost unpacking that and making it my own. And because I think that so often people just say, well, what's the magic formula? And the thing is the play, and that true play is, it's not a formula. And that's the thing Paul and I talk about a lot. Like, how do you scale this? Like, what sets and reps make it this thing? And you can on a base level, but the thing that makes it the ultimately stimulating experience is when you can make it your own, when you can read the athlete in front of you, when you're interacting with the athlete. Like, for example, I had a great session with a client the other day. Like, he texted me after and he's like, man, I just went to play volleyball. I was jumping about as high as I ever have, or as high as I ever have, feel super stimulated from our session. And a lot of the stuff we were doing is where I'm interacting with him. Like, we're doing dowel rod work together, where I'm making him do movements to react to a dowel rod in athletic ways. I'm making him hold a lunge. I'm throwing that little 3-color, you guys have probably seen like this little 3-handled 3-color thing. You call it a color.
Yeah.
So and when you do that, if you, for example, you have someone do a lunge hold or a wall sit or whatever, and they're distracted, like in the sense of they're on a task, the body processes that differently. And so you're kind of layering these different stimuli together in a way that it's just stimulating. It's kind of like you're doing a sport, but you can turn these levers and dials in a way that ups the output as you like, and then you can take it back down into like, okay, let's make these outputs real high. Now let's go back down, but let's have a lot of fun. Let's do a lot of interesting things that puts a smile on their face. Now let's go back to the outputs. And so it is like sport, but you can make it's like taking that in a training-based setting. But again, if I was working, that's somewhat context dependent. If I'm working with like military and it's very like protocol, we just want the protocol, let's lift, here's our sets and reps. Or it's a group that's already, hey, their workload bucket is in the red, they're full, they've done all this stuff. Maybe we just do the ISOs and make a little play-based, task-based work out of the ISOs. Have a little fun with that, but other than that, it's a lot more chill session. So the things that I've been working on particularly would be the visual element. So just things with the tennis ball, and that's becoming more popular during the tennis ball iterations, but also the visual aspect of that, even sneaking, like you could say vestibulo-ocular, like reflex, where you just basically think like the ball's in front of you, you're turning your head and you have to track it, or you're moving the ball away and your eyes have to track. And how does that impact how you track the ball? And then looking at your breathing with how you track the ball. So now it becomes, well, if I dropped it, did I get overly sympathetic when I was chasing it, where I was like, like too like you could say, like, if strength coaches know how to train but they forgot how to play, you would say maybe they'll drop the ball more often than an athlete because they get so charged up racing after the thing. And you start to detect why that might be in a more controlled setting. So things like that from a visual and reactive perspective, and how can I add that stimulation in the system, rhythm and like beats and metronome and all things related to movement, that almost is becoming, I mentioned I have a new course on like play and complex training and programming coming out, but I almost am like, I get a little ADD sometimes with course writing. Like I have like a running rhythm and locomotion course with rhythm because it is so powerful. I actually think that in 10 to 20 years, we might consider how we learn to move in terms of running, like cyclical skills, completely different, because if you just use rhythms to coach it and don't say a word, you can get incredible results. And it's very embodied for the athlete. It's kind of like, you're not having someone tell you what to do. You're just moving and flowing and staying on a beat and rhythm. And the intentional focus is huge, or the intentional network of the brain. So yeah, rhythm, a lot of visual stuff. And then just really working through different ways to categorically like gamify, but game, that can bring up like, oh, it's just kid stuff. Well, let's stimulate. How can I take this common training tool and have these stimulating branches of that training tool that can make things come to life for an athlete when we need it to in the training session? So yeah, those are some big things. Breathing as well. I'll just loop breathing in there, where again, this might not be so much the play, but it's more the embodied aspect of if it's breath in the course of an iso hold or breath cycles in running. It's like an embodied version of running. So maybe it's not play per se, but it's how can I make running more stimulating? How can I draw more focus and attention into the running process, where an athlete goes way more internal versus, oh, I hope I just make the time, this sucks, whatever. So yeah, those are some main areas that I've been moving in that. And then the last one, maybe if I round out with a 5, it's just getting more into youth sports, understanding, just a lot of it's just by doing, and a lot of it's just like seeing what my children who are 6, 8, and 0, so 0, I have a 9-month-old, 6 and 8-year-old, but how do they like to play? What do they like to do? What really lights their fire? And like to that, an example of just like, if I said, hey, here's a jump rope, jump over it as high as you can, they will be interested in that. But at some point, if they detect that it's like me judging how high they jump, or they start missing, it's not fun for them, various judgment networks can come in. But if you take the rope and you make it wavy, like Athletic Development Games, they have a course where they have different games for kids, and one is like make the rope wavy, like it's like just wave. Then they love it. They start like smiling and laughing, and then they don't even care how high it is. But that is a different form of the attentional network, because it's novel, and it's a novelty driver of the attentional network. And now you're not running through judgment loops of, oh, did I jump high enough? And that's kind of like the way we think when we play games, though. So it's children and attentional networks is also I don't know if it's on my bookshelf. It's probably upstairs. I was going through Nick Winkelman's book on the language of coaching and attentional networks, and part of that's in my coursework that I'm working on. But it's also just, there's a lot of really good stuff in there. So attentional networks within that whole thing is also a big area of interest. So I'm sorry, I just gave 5 like pew 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 all different directions. So have fun with that. I know what it's like to be on the other end. So I'm sorry I just gave you a bunch of stuff. I apologize for that. Those are some different directions.
That was great. That was great. I'm definitely looking forward to taking notes again and really revisiting that. But I do want to hang around that word that you mentioned with rhythm. Me, Phil, and we were talking about that a lot with Paul in our episode. But it's very interesting. It's been top of mind for me lately in terms of like when it comes to training. And it's always been something that's very challenging for me to explain to users mainly that quote unquote don't have it. Right. And for me, it was always, challenging for me to explain, even for myself, to like in my head. I know you could get it, whatever it is, but I'm curious to hear your experience about the topic of rhythm and your experience with, assuming if you started without it, but maybe you probably just had it growing up. But yeah, when
Joel,
it comes to
for
training,
context, JT is a great dancer. This guy's got rhythm like you wouldn't believe. So I feel like he has a hard time empathizing with people who don't.
Yeah.
Oh yes. How do you train it? How do we think about it, Joel? That's the main thing.
Yeah. No, I'll give you a quick anecdote that I thought was really cool. I did because I just saw this at soccer practice last night. And I did want to say this, and it might be slightly out of context, but I just thought it was so cool. Is we'll do, and this just going all the way back to children, who of course, hopefully in gym class they have something to music, something to attune, to tag movement to music or a beat, because it's you think about like just drumming, like there's just something about drums that makes you want to move. It's wired into our systems. It's part of who we are. And so we'll do red light, green light in soccer, where of course, if it's red light, you have your foot on the ball. If it's green light, you get to dribble. If it's yellow light, you go real slow. And I do yellow light a lot to make them like pay attention to how they're dribbling a little bit. But we have purple light, and purple light is just you dance. And I have actually come to realize I go heavy on purple light because I want kids to kind of tie in rhythm with how they move. And it's just funny because my son, he wasn't supposed to do this because you're supposed to stay in one place and dance. So I actually had this thought of dancing, trying to dance while dribbling, but that's too much for a 6-year-old. That could be way too much. My son, I obviously didn't tell him any of this, but he's trying to do the gritty and dribble at the same time. But I'm like, that is such a good. I
Did he
can't think
do
of
it?
a better training. Yeah, he did. And I
That's
can't
amazing.
think of a better training stimulus than that, because one, I didn't tell him to do that. So that number one is probably the number one thing that I did not tell you to do. That you came up with it as a creative solution on your own. But two, you are starting to attune rhythm to movement on the field. And this is a podcast or a conversation I would like to have at some point. There was a Simply Faster article by Nathan Huffstutter had written this on. I think it was something to do with the speed ladder and how, yes, of course, the speed guru who relies and just leans into the speed ladder. It's just a tool by itself. If that's what you're leaning on, you're only going to get so much out of it, But Nathan had talked about there's a basic lateral rhythms, like just simple side shuffle 1-2s that kids should be able to do to have jukes on the field, essentially. Like if you can't get in a ladder, and at least do some basic rhythmic lateral motions, activities, those you're probably not going to have jukes on the field. You're probably not going to have those rhythms to be able to make those adaptations on the field. And I think it is interesting because you do see like elite athletes. There's like a Tyreek Hill, him just blasting through the speed ladder. Of course, the speed ladder is not what made Tyreek Hill. But I don't think we should undersell the fact that there are some basic rhythms that kids should just have. And hopefully they get it. I mean, chances are they're probably going to get it without ever seeing a speed ladder in their life. But if you are going to use that tool, I think it's a great place to reduce some degrees of freedom and rehearse a few rhythms and use that as a primer, because let's prime with some of these actions. Let's attune ourselves not to the coach blowing the whistle and everything like a robot. Let's attune ourselves to the rhythm of movement, and then maybe we roll the ball out after that, or maybe then we do some one-on-ones if you wanted to do it that way. Probably do it the other way too. So yeah, that's one thing I've been thinking about recently, but then also with Paul. Paul was the very first person I've ever worked with who, like, it's like the music's on and we're going, I just remember it like it was yesterday. The first workout I did with him, we're just going through all these sprint drills, but he's just creating on the fly to whatever music is on. And so there you have an attentional network boost from just trying to do it to the rhythm. And you also have a novelty boost because you've never done this before. And you have another novelty boost because Paul's just making up moves and you're trying to follow along. And the end result is just, it's very stimulating. And it also, if you have a group of athletes trying to do that, even if it's just basic, even if it's just, I just want you to hop on one leg to the rhythm or something, you learn very quickly who can do that and who can't. But I think it's also, if you make it just exceedingly simple, and so people don't feel like it's a dance or like they can't fail, like if you just, hey, hop on 2 legs to the rhythm, everybody can do that. I've never seen people who can't do that. I warm up running. I mentioned training military trainees, and we work to rhythm. And eventually we funnel into the breath, the rhythm of the breath, because you always have that with you. You don't need music. And obviously in the field, you're not going to be on like a long ruck or something and have like music. Like, they have cadences, they do, but like what you have internally is always your cadence. It can be. And that's like also very embodying. But just a lot to say. It was Paul who really turned me on to that. And then we started like men's tennis. I started putting like techno or house on, and we do like crawls and rolls. I just have it on and just see what they did, honestly, at first. But I got that from Dave Dirt. So working at Cal with the swim programs was really, really good for me on so many levels, because these are two coaches who have both been the Olympic head coach on the men's and women's side. And the men's coach, and they both had just coaching superpowers on the levels of either group management, that mind of the athlete, creativity and sensory feedback, and how technique comes about in coaching. I mean, it was such a great spectrum of just coaching outside the gym for me. And Dave would put on music that reflected what he wanted out of practice. So if it was just like a lot of really taxing repeats, he would put on deep house because he's like, it keeps these guys in the moment, in the motion of it. It's again, it's not all things in your environment make who you are. It's not just the sets and reps, which is ironic. So often it's like you guys have mentioned this, like, what's the sets and reps? Well, yes, but environment, like,
Yeah.
and that's just that's like, I hate saying red pill because it's overused, but if there was one, I think it's that it's not that you're training, the totality of your training is the product of the whole environment. It's not just a singular protocol. And yeah, it's just kind of all gone out from there. And I did not grow up in an environment where dancing was like a thing at all. But once I got to high school, I started to get into like break dance and hip hop and that kind of thing. And I just loved it. It's something that is like, I am probably a more rhythmic person than average in that respect. Like I do a lot of my own training with rhythm based work. So yeah, it's easy for me, I guess. But like, yeah, like I said, can you understand? Can you make it simple for somebody else who might not have a dance or any background like that?
Well, it's funny because you mentioned military a few times now, and as you were mentioning that, like even then, so like I don't have a military background, but they do as a group have a lot of like chants almost, or like
Yes.
unified steps in a lot
Yeah.
of places, even countries. So it's interesting to think about that a little bit more. Like there is some type of rhythmic involvement, or if you will, in our own human nature, no matter where we are. And it almost exists in certain places where we don't even think would exist,
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very ubiquitous. Even like stuff like the haka, or like just stuff that's people chanting together. There was a really good, it was on YouTube. I think if you YouTube tempo Japanese running warm up or something, or sprint Japanese running drills, that was it. It's this elite academy in Japan, and there's these, I think it's high schoolers, and a bunch of them. I think the standard to get in there is like a 15-minute 5K or something. It's like extremely competitive. And their warm-up is the epitome of all that stuff. They're going through their drills in rhythm while chanting. It is amazing. Like I was like, this is awesome. It was so good. So it was kind of like, but I think that kind of idea, like you said, it's been in military culture for a long time, and for a very good reason.
That's really cool. No, I think I have like similar anecdotes about rhythm. One of my good friends who was a disciple of Paul Cater, my friend Gene, him and I were playing some tennis, just rallying one night, like late nights, like 10 p.m. No one's around, lights are on, and I'm playing like absolute garbage. I'm not moving my feet. I'm not seeing the ball well. And he was like, "Bro, you define the rhythm." And I was like, "What are you like? Stop. What are you talking about? What are you saying?" He throws on some deep house music. He's like, let's just move our feet to the rhythm. And we were literally like moving our feet to the rhythm, like almost rallying to the rhythm. And like everything fell away and everything changed. I'm hitting the ball well. I'm moving my feet well. I'm getting into good positions. And there, anecdotally, again, like there definitely is something to that. And you mentioned sprint drills and Paul making sprint drills on the fly. And I think I've heard you talk about this before, but this, we tend to lean on these kind of rote sprint drills where it's hit this position and do this, and this wall drill or this kind of march and skip variation. Like, is there a time and a place for that stuff, or is it probably more so let's lean on the exploration, let's lean on maybe a little bit more meaningful variability, let them kind of play and explore and find that rhythm, so to speak?
Yeah. I'm not convinced that the typical warm up, like, okay, let's do walking marches and lunges and A skips and B skips and C skips and backwards run. I think that certainly carries value without question. My question to that would it be better if you dug into a couple of those things with more depth, right? Like, I'm very much into like a lot of educational topics. Like I mentioned, I have younger kids, so my wife and I are we listen to like stuff that bags on the modern educational system quite frequently. And one of the critiques is that you have kids who are in like, they're in 7 different classes. And this is where like a lot of alternative education differs from traditional education, where traditional education, you have 7 different subjects the whole day or whatever. And so you're learning each for an hour. And the theory would say that learning is very wide, but it's not deep. And a lot of it doesn't really stick. Versus alternative schools like a Montessori type alternative education will have longer blocks of one thing, and a lot of it's very autonomy. There's a lot of self-driven autonomy into a deeper period of time. And so the question may be then, and this is something I'm working through currently as I'm making my mind up on this, especially to working with younger athletes, because I think it's okay to do those drills, but you have to ask yourself, well, what if we just do iso lunge and we work in that for an extended period of time, or a cross connect march and we just work that for 5 minutes? A lot of my workouts, like my off day workouts, where it used to be like, okay, it's a flush out day. And a lot of times it would be, all right, here's a medicine ball circuit with 8 exercises, and here's a crawl circuit with 8 exercises. And yeah, it definitely gets you flushed out. It's very variable, but I'll also put like here's a very simple day of flush out work is rolling exploration. So just do rolls for 15 minutes, however you like, the variability comes from how you choose, but you're rolling. And by the end of that 15 minutes, you're gonna be pretty good at rolling, but it's this a very, like, there's a lot of ground. And then it might be 10 minutes of standing cross connect and take breaks when you want. And by the end, you will be so familiar with all the impacts of that cross connect that you would never get to with, I hate to say 3 sets of 10 because I think 3 sets of 10 is okay, but a lot of times you just touch on, and then maybe at the end it's like, all right, do 300 Superman cross crawls, like Tommy John style Superman cross crawl. And in that sense, you are becoming very, very familiar with, as you pass through layers of fatigue and depth of how your body operates. And so that's a very depth-oriented day and system. And I don't think we tend to consider days on the level of learning. And so that just being said, I just think the common thing, it's not that A skips are bad, but I don't know, what if you did 400 meters of A skips and saw what happened? And I think you learn a lot more about how it transfers or doesn't transfer to the thing you're doing. And even something like, and that's just where I think there's so much argument about X training method. Is this good? Is it bad? Why don't you go do it for 30 minutes and tell me what you think, because no one wants to spend that much time with something. And even something like, okay, like sprint dribbles is very common. It's a tool, right? Is it good? Is it bad? Do sprint dribbles for 200 meters for a few sets. And sorry about that. My phone is connected to my computer. I don't even have it here, but it's ringing. So I apologize. It was funny if it was Paul Gator. I'll talk to him after. It's a sign. But if you do dribbles like for 200 meters, then sprint, see what happens. For a lot of people, your legs are going to feel like iron rods. You're going to be so externally rotated, you're not loading on the internal. But that's what I'm saying. Like, it's rare that we expose people to a stimulus for long enough to gain true depth. It's usually like, do the protocol. Trust me, it's good for you. But there's not as much of that giving that athlete that embodied experience. But again, it can be challenging in an environment where if you're in the private sector and I have athletes come in and it's like, okay, we're going to start with 10 minutes of cross crawl or 3 minutes of iso lunge, and they aren't bought in, then they might be like, oh, this is boring, or why am I doing this? And a lot of times too, people who there could be a lot of really good athletes who don't have the discipline for that. So, and maybe you have to then find something they do attune to, and it's probably more related to their sport that they can find a level of discipline with. So, I hope I answered the question. I was kind of running a few.
No, I think I would tend to agree with that kind of line of reasoning, right? One thing I always say is, if you want to be good at something, you got to do it all the time. Like thinking about how anyone gets good at any other skill, whether it's playing the piano or shooting a basketball or writing, you do it a lot. You have to do it a ton. And then I think we look at movement like a squat pattern, or like your first step in acceleration, or you name it, in or outside of the gym, and it's 3 sets of 10 or 3 by 20 yards, or it's such a small exposure, like once or twice a week, and then we sit back and we're like, yeah, they suck at this.
Yep.
And it's like, I wonder why, because you're not really exposing them to it at a level where, like you're saying, like where they're getting actual, like a deep
Yes.
learning of what it is.
Yeah. I think we just kind of live in that society, like even social media. Like the things that get the most leverage tend to be the things that are the most superficial. And the deeper you go, you just get less engagement because a lot of people don't have the patience to get to that level of depth. So it's very, I don't think that is rewarded as much as that, like, hey, quick tips. It's even how we coach sometimes, quick tips. But that kind of learning is not as deep and long lasting as that thing that, hey, just sit in this for a while. Like when Tommy John, the first workout I ever did with him, he said, do 100 3-way hip circles. First exercise. It took me 10 minutes, and he didn't say a word to me the whole time. It's like Mr. Miyagi saying, paint the fence, wax on, wax off, which is also a really good. That's also karate. I just watched The Karate Kid with my children for the first time a couple weeks ago. And I was watching that, how Mr. Miyagi taught the wax on, wax off. Of course, there's a lot of lack of representative action when he actually gets into fighting. I don't think it would have worked that way. But, the whole the whole wax on, wax off thing, I was like, that's brilliant because it's a depth. And it's not like the coach hovering over your shoulder. You're sitting there with a stimulus for an extended period of time. And I think that's where just so much true learning works. But our society is so departed from that approach to things. And so I'm not saying all your learning has to be that, but I do think we should at least program something like that for athletes periodically, because they're going to get a lot out of it. I even just had like Brady Volmering. He'll be on my podcast next week, guest. And he was talking about that with his impulses. Like he does impulses. Like if you've seen him, it's like with a rope and lever, and you just keep like slamming into the lever, like impulse hits over and over and over again for hundreds of reps. And it's not till you get into a little fatigue that you, as an individual human, learn something in a way that a coach can't tell you. And that's just the beauty of it, really. That the coach basically, no one can tell you this. You just do the thing, and now you figure it out.
Man.
Yeah.
I'm gonna watch that. This weekend. Give me some insights on my programming for the next month.
Throw it on a little Karate Kid. No, I think it's funny you mentioned the fatigue element. Like fatigue is one of those things that I found consistently where it really shows you like how people move and how people choose to organize movement. Like skipping, like you're saying, skipping when you're fresh is one thing, and then doing it when you're under like massive fatigue is a totally different thing. Like I think about something intricate like a tennis serve because I'm obsessed with that at the moment. But like, my first 5 serves look beautiful, but when I'm in the second set, it looks like, I've never played tennis before. And that's just like the fatigue setting in and like totally changing the movement strategy. And like you say, like you can kind of tap in to something else and like see like, oh, I'm changing my ball toss, or oh, I'm setting up trophies or whatever way. Like is that something that you try to guide like with your athletes, like as they're as you're encouraging them to explore movement and embrace some sort of form of variability, like do you try to like guide that process a little bit, or do you just kind of let it flow?
Honestly, I wish I had an answer that was like, yes, this is exactly what I do. And I just give out movements that require repetitions, and just I'll hear back from athletes occasionally, and a lot of times they'll just say, I liked it. Okay, that's awesome. Good. That's great. I will say, if it was more nuanced, and this might be something I start doing with track at some point, but like in high jump, for example, track's good because they have these examples. I mean, one, if it's sprinting, just go run a 300 fast, and there you go. Because as you run through that 300, you're going to be working. The last 50 is going to be very different than the first 50 because you have lactic or hydrogen ions, like those kind of things rising up, and you have to stick with the rhythm. You have to find ways to keep the rhythm of the movement going. And so in there, you have its own teaching. But I like Jeremy Fisher is a jumps coach out in Chula Vista, works for the U.S. Olympic Training Center, and he has something he calls a 2-minute drill. So it's like triple jump. It's basically you do a short approach triple jump, you land, you jog back to the start, and then you go again for 2 minutes. You're just going and going and going. And by the end, it's a different experience, but it's an embodiment of something that the coach can't teach you. And some people would look on that on the outside and say, oh, it's endurance. Oh, yeah, like jump endurance, which honestly isn't really that important. Maybe it's capacity. But what's really the thing is when you're in a semi-fatigued state, well, one, there's your brain is in a different place. There is something happening when you're in a light aerobic and fatigue state where you're processing movement. You're not thinking, okay, coach said put my hand here and my arm here and my toe. That's not on the radar. And that's really good because that's not how our bodies really learn anyway. So you're in a place where you are accessing a more valuable learning place. But even more so to my thought is you can't get by with power. You have to rely on elastic properties more because you don't have the concentric force outputs at that point. And I think that's the gold that maybe we don't think about. It's one, you have learning in a way that's honestly deeper and more valuable. And two, you have to rely on the elastic processes more. So if it was like tennis, you would say, all right, do machine gun style, 20 serves in a row. What did you notice? How did it change?
Yeah.
And Dan John talks about that for throwing, like machine gun throws or something like discus. So here's a discus, here's a discus, here's a discus.
Just ripping them.
Yeah, just ripping them. But I don't think it has to be your whole training, but I've grown to value the learning that comes there. And just because we tend to polarize it so much, it's like everything's max power and only max power. And there's only so that will teach you, but there's a layer you are not going to get by only defaulting to max power iterations.
Yeah, I think, and that it's almost like we get too output focused. I think we get a little bit too almost like overly systematized, like as a strength coach, where it's like, if you look at me 5 years ago and I would have heard a protocol like that, where it's like 2-minute drill of jumping, and I've been like, that's silly, and like not even have the bandwidth to try to understand like this coach is coaching at a high level and has Olympic level jumpers. Like there's probably a deeper meaning that I just can't even understand yet. Like you mentioned that you yourself are just kind of like naturally curious. Like is that how you view training in general, where it's like you see something and your first thought is like, that's cool. I wonder how that works, and like start to explore it a little bit.
Yes. So much so that I almost have to look at that part of myself with another lens, because I can get so curious and exploratory that, as I mentioned, you have that childlike state of play and pure present moment orientation. That is an essential part of the equation. If you don't have that, training is not fun, and you won't be like that. Your timing will be off. Like that level of stimulation, like the play level of stimulation will not be there. But on the other end, you have to have a firm structure. You have to have a firm enough structure. You have to have rules and principles. And so for me, I actually have to watch myself sometimes by not going almost so far into the play-based system that I lose the structure. And usually it works out pretty well. I mean, even that, I mentioned that athlete who sent me the text message of I'm jumping the highest I ever have after the session. I made that whole session up on the spot, and I didn't know what I was going to do till I threw the first thing, basically the first thing at him. But it took me 10 years to get to that point, because I think if you were to say, oh, you made the whole thing up, well, you're just, pulling stuff out of your butt and you're just but it's like, no, I'm doing this because I've spent 10 years mastering all these elements, and I can do this. But that being said, if I was coaching, like coaching track or writing programs, and this is the thing, I guess I hadn't mentioned this, I write, I have a couple dozen online clients that I write a structured program for every month. So that's the structured part. And it's almost like outside of all that structured work, which I still do write room for autonomy and play within there when I can. It's like when I'm in person, it's like, let's play. Because I just wrote 12 programs, structured programs this week. Let's go play. And so, yeah, I've actually, when I was coaching track at Cal, the coaches who used to be that, they aren't there anymore, but they are like, I think Joel's experimenting a little bit on our athletes. Like, I just wanted to find out what worked, maybe to a detriment, to be honest. So I do see that side, that potential side. But yeah, I'm always like super curious. And even people said that about Bondarchuk, the throws coach. Like, they was just throwing crap against the wall to see what stuck, because he wanted to know, he wanted to find out. And so, yeah, there's that time for structure, and a lot of that's with the stuff I write up formally. But when I'm going in person, a lot of times I'm really trying to get the play-based stimulus out of it and further that end of the equation.
I guess it's almost fair to say that you already had an idea of at least what you're looking for, even though you could quote unquote say you're making it up, because I think there's a difference there, right? Like you mentioned
Yeah.
early on in your career, if you say you're making it up, you're literally just making it up.
Yes.
But
Yes.
then
Exactly.
15 years later down the line, I think you have an idea of certain principles in your head that you're looking for based off of the play that you're going to implement for the session, right? And I think, yeah, for me, I'm still learning how to do that myself, and it just took me a long time to really understand, like, we're really not making it up, but we're not also programming hours before as we do with other, um, athletes, if it's online or whatnot. But so it's interesting that you say that because it gives me another way to really think about um, approaching in-person sessions and
Mm.
for both the athlete and the coach, right? I think we talk about burnout a lot in our show, so
Yeah.
it's a good way to really improve the what's the word you often use, like the stimulus for
Yeah.
both or all people in the session. But
Mhm.
curious if you can talk a little bit more about the upcoming program that you've been teasing us about.
Oh yeah.
Want to learn more about it and essentially learn the protocols of play. I don't know if that's a buzz
Yeah.
term yet, but
Yeah. Protocols of
Alliteration.
play. Oh, I called it the wrong thing. That's actually those two, that title is almost like a dichotomy in itself. So it's like an interesting play on words. I'll have to keep that in mind for something, maybe like a module in the course. But I
there
did
you go.
actually want to touch on something you said, JT, was for the coach and the burnout, because I do think we all know what it's like to sit there and administer a totally preset program. It
Mhm.
can be very boring. And that's even where Tommy at his gym, Tommy John, he would be at his, like, he was like a chiropractor at the time. I think he burned his license, for people who don't know about Tommy. He's a fascinating dude. And he had a chiro table. He would kind of sit there and he would give out prescriptions. He would give out like a prescription, like do 100 3-way leg circles. The person would go do it, come back. Okay, what's next? And there would be like 5 or 6 people all rotating in that type of format.
Hmm.
And again, it's like, there's so many more ways of doing this than, okay, here's the card, do the card. I'm going to motivate you throughout doing the card. Like, I almost call them, like, in the course, I call it like the hinge. It's like a hinge that allows room for art and stimulus and play and things that make the session come to life. And so, yes, all that being said, yeah, I think it's so beneficial for the mind of the coach to feel like you are a part of this. You are like, you're not just sitting there motivating athletes through something written. You are an interacting part of not just the conversation with the person. I think in the private sector, it becomes, let's talk about your day and your work and your this and that and the other thing while we go through 3 sets of 10. It's like we are interacting embodied in movement together as we go through this. And I think that's just the thing that's missing. I think in 20 years, that's going to be we're going to be like, wow, how did we ever train back 30 years ago where you just read off the card and, so anyways, yeah, the course is called Athletic Fusion. And so where Elastic Essentials was very much the what. So in terms of, hey, if we're not just judging the success of a program by barbell maxes, what are all the movement-based qualities? How do we do those? That's Elastic Essentials really gets into that. This one, I had a lot of people asking me about more about programming. So this one gets into creative programming application and how do we take the play and the aliveness wing and put that onto our programming. And then it gets into layering out, how do we do complex training? People like, oh, is French contrast good or bad or what? Like, this gets into digging in, okay, serial applications, singular fatigue and depth versus more width and complex training. How do we make this art and alive and just a more comprehensive experience? That's what this course is all about, and it should be out. I'm always hyper optimistic when I'm going to get the course out, but hopefully within a month. I almost have all the iteration of it complete, so we'll start filming soon. Super excited for it. Yeah, so that'll fit. Yeah, that'll round out the triad of Elastic Essentials, Sprint Acceleration, and then Athletic Fusion.
Oh, yeah, no, we got the first 2. Excited for the third. Where can people learn more about what you got going on, your podcast, your courses, everything like that?
Sure. Yeah. Justflysports.com with dashes, which is not good for a SEO perspective, harder to find. But you know what? If you Google Just Fly Sports, it should be the main one that comes up. So that or any of the social media channels, Twitter and Instagram are the ones I'm most active on.
Oh, that damn SEO gets everybody.
Yep.
Gets everybody. But no, Joel, this was Absolutely incredible, man. I think I could probably ask you 40 more questions about play, but no, thank you so much for coming on the show. It was a blast.
Yeah. Phil,
Thanks,
JT,
Joel.
thank you. Yeah, thank you
Yes,
guys.
sir. Chat with you soon.